You've often heard me say that the fundamental fantasy is that the big other exists, that wholeness can be attained. It's come up in the discussions from this series that maybe this would be a fundamental fantasy uniquely suited to obsessives, and that there might be, for instance, a hysteric fundamental fantasy that would be quite different. I'm not entirely willing to go there. I still believe, reading especially this chapter in Seminar 16, that the fundamental fantasy is fundamentally that the other exists. And Lacan here draws that out, not so much at the level of neurosis, although that's a little present here as well. And he doesn't make a distinction between the subcategories of neurosis. He draws this out at the level of perversion. In fact, what I would say is that chapter 16 of Seminar 16 is a terrific summary of what Lacan is doing with perversion, particularly around the drive. The action begins on page 7, where Lacan just spells it out. The pervert is the one who devotes himself to filling this hole in the other. So the barred other equals the big other minus jouissance, you heard me say. The result is that the barred other has a hole in it, a space or a lack, a void that has been opened up by the excision of jouissance. The pervert, according to Lacan, is someone who tries to help the big other, notably its avatars, fill in this hole. That up to a certain point, to give here the colors that give their relief to things, I would say that he is in favor of the other existing, that he is a defender of the faith. Faith in this case that the big other exists. But you also have to hear this in terms of religion. The big other in the West is not just capital. The big other is God. The other big C, Christianity in the West, gives us a version of the big other as omniscient, as omnipotent, as whole, as complete, as everything, as universalized. And so when Lacan says the pervert doesn't just want to fill in the hole in the other and thus render it whole, complete, and so forth, but that he has faith, the pervert, that he can do this. He's a defender of the faith. You have to hear this also in terms of religiosity. And you have to also know that the problem with God in the West is not that he's dead, as Nietzsche said, and it's not that he's dead and doesn't know it, as you get from the Freud to Lacan tradition. The problem with God is that he doesn't go to church. God doesn't go to church. God doesn't have anyone to pray to. There is no God of God in the Christian tradition. The tradition in the West alongside capitalism that props up so much of what we count as society. The problem with God is he ain't got a God. The same is true of the big other, right? The difference between the barred subject and the barred other is that the barred other lacks a relationship to a barred other, to a big other, like the one that each of us as barred subjects suffers through. You've heard us work through this. Now what we're working at is a parallel, very explicit here in chapter 16, between the big other and God. And this hint at it with the defender of the faith as the pervert who has faith that the big other can be made to exist is important right along these lines. Perversion here, in other words, is dedicated to filling in the hole in the other that is left behind by the evacuation of jouissance. And this resulting big other is not unlike that of the Christian God. Check out the next sentence. Moreover, in looking more closely at the observations in this light that makes the pervert a singular auxiliary of God. Let's read on and see what we can make of this stuff. You often hear that phrase from me, see what we can make, let's see where we go from here. I can't emphasize this enough. I'm reading these materials along with you. I haven't read this seminar and am now showing up to pronounce what they're all about. I'm actively reading these materials, generating these commentaries live, or at least live at the time of the recording that you're now watching, and reading this stuff with you. So yesterday, as I was reading page 8, I saw more evidence of this understanding of perversion. It is the enjoyment of the big other that the exhibitionist watches over. It's interesting here. The big other is barred because jouissance, enjoyment, has been evacuated from it. And this is precisely what the pervert hopes to provide the big other with, namely enjoyment. What was taken from the big other, rendering it barred in this formula Lacan's giving us here, the pervert, be it exhibitionist, be it voyeur, be it sadomasochist, all are discussed here in chapter 16, tries to give it back and serves as a particular support, a supplement, a supply. Recall our second diagram, or our first diagram, I should say, for the other that this partner gives, that the pervert hopes to give, to provide the big other with a support or a supply. It is in this field, the field of the big other, qua deserted by enjoyment, that the exhibitionistic act is posited to give rise there to a look, which is not symmetrical to what the voyeur is up to. The point here is that perversion is once again, regardless of what submodality we're discussing, is dedicated to returning to the barred other, the jouissance that was taken from it. Then we're on to the sadomasochistic drive. Really good stuff on page 10 with regard to perversion and around enjoyment, which centrally is the topic here. Don't get it twisted. We are talking about enjoyment. It is enough to have worked with an exhibitionist to see that one understands nothing about what in appearance I will not say makes him enjoy himself, since he does not enjoy himself. But check it out. Look at how Lacan puts a twist on this. And yet he enjoys himself all the same, and on a single condition of taking the step that I have just said, namely, that the enjoyment that is at stake is that of the big other. Naturally, there is a gap. You are not crusaders. You do not consecrate yourself to ensuring that the big other, namely something or other blind and perhaps dead, should enjoy. But the exhibitionist, for his part, is interested in that. It is in that way that he is a defender of the faith. Here again, you see the Christian undertones popping up here. You are not crusaders. You do not consecrate yourself. And then we're dealing with an other that is blind and perhaps dead. Think about Nietzsche to Freud to Lacan on God being dead and not knowing it. And here again, an exhibitionist, as pervert, is a defender of the faith. And to reiterate, this is the same faith that is baked into every fundamental fantasy, that the big other exists. Or because here we're talking about faith, that it can be made to exist. The barred other may be what exists at present. The fantasy of the pervert is that that barred other can be repaired, refilled, have its hollow filled with jouissance, have jouissance return to it. And the pervert is what brings that to the big other. We could go on in this direction, as Lacan certainly does. That is why, to catch up, I let myself go in speaking about crusaders. To believe in the big other, the cross, the French words linking up like that, and so on and so forth. Here you see, to believe in the big other, the cross, read God in the sense of omniscience, omnipotence, and the like. We know what God lacks. God lacks a God like the one he asks us to obey. And again, that's the problem. It's not that God is dead. It's not that he don't know it. The problem is that God don't pray. God can't pray. God can't worship. There is no church for God to attend. There ain't no God of God. There is no other of the other. The question in many ways with perversion is, with what does the pervert aim to fill in the hollow that constitutes the barred other? What are you going to fill it in? With your look? With their look? With a voice? This is part of what we get to when we arrive at page 12 in a terrific middle chapter, convoluted in some ways, but also terrific middle chapter here in Seminar 16, page 12. What is at stake is the voice. And here he's talking about sadomasochistic forms of perversion. This voice that he then goes on to link up with objet a, there's the whole, and then he's right back in the middle of the page to the vestibular system, or the semicircular canals. He says, I already gave you a glimpse of this a fortnight ago. So here, think back to the end of chapter 14, when he's talking about one of these primitive animals, this tiny shrimp, and talking about the oral cavity of this primitive animal. And here he wants to add another animal to the list and play on the mythical echoes. You can read all this on your own. What matters for us is what Lacan then does at the bottom of page 12 when he gets back to the hollow. Check this out. Let it not distract us from the fact that the animal, when at each molting it is stripped of all the outside of its systems, is obliged, and with good reason, because otherwise he would not be able to move in this way, to set up, here we go, in the hollow opened up at his animal level on the outside, in the hollow of what is nothing less than an ear, some little grains of sand, so that they tickle it in there. And now we get to another function of objet a. Objet a doesn't just name the hollow. It doesn't just signal the lack or circumscribe the opening. It is also like a little piece of sand that can get stuck in someone's ear, in someone's vestibular system. Sand is like an object inside the hollow that tickles it from the inside. And you have to think about this now. You have the barred other that's been hollowed out and evacuated of jouissance, which leaves a hollow or an opening. We simultaneously use little a to designate that opening. Here Lacan is giving us the other function of object, little a, namely as an object. It's also something that rattles around in that hollow. It's something the pervert hopes is big enough to fill the hollow, but it's something that the analyst can look at and see how it just rattles around instead. The pervert's fundamental fantasy that they can fill in the hollow in the barred other and thus transform the barred other into the big other is, like every fundamental fantasy, just that, a fantasy. No matter what you put in that hole, it's never big enough to fill it. Everything you put in there is like a grain of sand put into someone's oral cavity, an opening in which the sand rattles around. And here's that verb again, tickling this opening from the inside. This is an important part of the function, what Lacan here calls the function of objet a. It doesn't just name the hollow. It can also serve as something that rattles around inside it. It's almost like Lacan should have chosen another term, another algebraic symbol to describe these two different functions. Why he does not, we can discuss. But here it is. Objet a is an object and an opening. It's an opening that can be transformed into an object of inquiry. And it's an object that, when looked at alongside those of modern science, doesn't look like much of an object at all. As small, perhaps, and even as insignificant, perhaps, as the modern scientist might regard a grain of sand.